Welcome to the darkest chapter of country music history. Number 1. Stringbean. David Stringbean Ackerman was a beloved legend. A tall, lanky banjo player with a comedic scarecrow persona who made millions laugh on the hit television show Hee Haw and the Grand Ole Opry stage. He was the definition of a gentle country soul, a man who preferred his modest cabin in the woods to any mansion in Nashville. A man who loved his wife Estelle and his simple life among the trees. But Stringbean had a quirk that would cost him everything. He was a child of the Great Depression. He had watched banks fail and fortunes vanish overnight. He did not trust financial institutions. Rumors swirled through the backwoods communities that he kept thousands of dollars in cash, stuffed inside his trademark overalls or hidden somewhere in his rustic home. These rumors reached the ears of two cousins named John and Marvin Brown. They decided to pay him a visit. On that cold Saturday night, John and Marvin broke into the Ackerman cabin hours before Stringbean was scheduled to return from his performance at the Opry. They tore through the house looking for the legendary fortune. They found nothing. Frustrated and armed, they made a decision that would haunt Nashville forever. They turned off the lights. They sat down in the shadows. And they waited. But the cousins had a method to their madness. They turned on Stringbean's radio and tuned it to the live Grand Ole Opry broadcast. They listened to the very show their victim was performing on. When they heard his segment end, they knew exactly how long they had before he walked through that door. When Stringbean and Estelle finally drove up their gravel driveway after a night of making people smile, they had no idea that the devil was already inside their home. Stringbean walked through the front door and saw the intruders emerging from the darkness. He reportedly tried to pull his own pistol to protect his home. He never had a chance. The cousins shot him point blank in the chest. The beloved entertainer who had spent his evening making thousands of people laugh collapsed dead in his own doorway. But the horror was just beginning. Estelle was still outside in the car. Hearing the gunshots, she tried to run. The killers chased her across the lawn like hunters pursuing wounded prey. As she fell to her knees in the cold grass, begging for her life, they executed her with a shot to the back of the head. I want to ask you a haunting question about rural myths. Stringbean died because of a rumor. He did not actually have a massive fortune hidden in his house. The whispered legend of his hidden wealth was wildly exaggerated. Do you think small-town gossip is dangerous? How many lives have been destroyed because someone whispered a lie that transformed into a fact in the minds of desperate men? The most chilling detail of this crime is what happened after the shooting. After killing two beloved grandparents of country music, the cousins did not flee immediately. They went back inside the cabin. They found a pan of fried chicken that Estelle had prepared earlier that evening. They sat down at the dead woman's table, ate her chicken, and listened to the Grand Ole Opry on the radio, the very show Stringbean had just performed on. They raided the refrigerator. They made themselves comfortable, all while the bodies lay just yards away. I want to ask you a sickening question about the nature of evil. Robbery is one thing, but eating the victim's dinner after executing them requires a different species of darkness. Does this detail convince you that some human beings are born without a conscience? How can a person lift food to their mouth with the blood of an innocent woman still fresh on the ground outside? The bodies were discovered the next morning by their neighbor and fellow country legend, Grandpa Jones. He had come over to go hunting with his best friend. Instead, he found Stringbean dead on the porch and Estelle lying in the yard. The image haunted Grandpa Jones for the rest of his life. He never fully recovered from what he saw that morning. The killers were eventually caught because they could not keep their mouths shut. They bragged about the crime. Both cousins were convicted and sentenced to 198 years in prison. Marvin died behind bars in 2003. John was controversially paroled in 2014 after serving 41 years, a decision that reopened wounds across Nashville. But the tragic irony remains. The fortune they killed for did not exist in the way they imagined. They stole a chainsaw and a few guns. In 1996, 23 years after the murders, the new owners of the cabin found $20,000 in rotted, mouse-chewed cash hidden behind a brick in the chimney. Money the killers had missed. Money that was worthless by the time it was discovered. I want to ask you about the death of trust. Before this murder, country stars lived openly. They did not have gates or security systems or bodyguards. They were just folks. After String Bean, everyone in Nashville bought guns and built fences. Do you think we can ever return to a time when we trust our neighbors? Or has violence permanently destroyed the idea of an open door? This is the horrific story of the Cabin Massacre. A crime so brutal, it changed the way country stars lived forever. String Bean made the world laugh with his banjo, but he left the world weeping over his blood-soaked doorstep. If this terrifying story left you cold, stay with me. Nashville's nightmare was not over. Number 2, James Philip Widener. Just 17 days after String Bean's murder, another killing rocked Music Row. The date is November 27, 1973. This story proves that lightning can indeed strike twice. Guitarist James Philip Widener drove to the North Nashville Holiday Inn that night. He was meeting the widow of songwriter Eddie Hazelwood, who was generously gifting him a collection of unreleased songs. It should have been a moment of artistic inheritance. Instead, it became a bloodbath. Both Widener and Mrs. Hazelwood were accosted by 3 men in the parking lot. They were beaten. They were robbed. And then they were coldly shot dead under the dim lights of that hotel. The killers bundled both bodies into the trunk of Widener's own car and dumped them in an alley like garbage. The murderers were caught within a week. Their downfall was stupidity. They tried to use Widener's stolen credit card at a Memphis store. The signature did not match. The police were called, and 3 killers went to prison. I want to ask you about the psychology of crime waves. 2 brutal murders of country music figures in less than 3 weeks. Nashville had never experienced anything like this. The community that had always felt like a small town suddenly felt like a war zone. Do you think violence is contagious? When one horrific crime goes unpunished for even a few days, does it embolden other predators to strike? The double murders of 1973 created what historians call a siege mentality in Nashville's music community. The era of unlocked doors and trusting strangers was over. Artists who had once wandered freely among their fans now looked over their shoulders. The family atmosphere of country music had been shattered by gunfire. This is the story of the parking lot execution. James Philip Widener went to collect songs and instead became one. He is the forgotten victim of 1973, the year Nashville learned that fame could not protect you from the darkness lurking in desperate hearts. If these stories of the Cabin Massacre and the parking lot execution left you shaken, know that we have only begun our journey. The violence will cross borders, the body count will rise, and the methods will become even more horrific. Number 3, Chalino Sanchez. We leave the blood-stained hills of Tennessee and travel south to the sun-scorched borderlands of Mexico. The date is May 16, 1992. This story is the founding tragedy of an epidemic that would claim dozens of lives over the next 3 decades. Chalino Sanchez was not a polished Nashville star. He was something rawer, something more dangerous. born into crushing poverty in Sinaloa, Mexico. He had lived a life that most country singers only pretended to understand. At the age of 15, Chalino witnessed a man rape his sister. He did not call the police. He did not seek justice through courts. He found the rapist and killed him with his own hands. Then he fled across the border to California, where he worked as a dishwasher, a car washer, and eventually discovered he could write songs. But not just any songs. Chalino Sanchez became the godfather of narco corrido, the ballad form that celebrates drug traffickers, outlaws, and the violent code of the Mexican underworld. His voice was not beautiful by traditional standards. It was nasal, rough, authentic. It sounded like the voice of a man who had actually lived the stories he was telling, because he had. His fame spread through bootleg cassette tapes sold at swap meets and flea markets. He became a legend among the working class and the criminal class alike. Cartel bosses requested songs written in their honor. Chalino obliged. He was playing a dangerous game, and he knew it. Just 4 months before his death, Chalino survived an assassination attempt at a concert in Coachella, California. A gunman opened fire during his performance. Chalino, ever the survivor, pulled his own weapon and returned fire. A bystander was killed in the chaos. Chalino walked away with a bullet wound, but his life intact. He should have recognized the warning sign. The cartels were circling. On the night of May 15, 1992, Chalino performed at a concert hall in Culiacan, the heart of Sinaloa cartel territory. During the performance, someone in the crowd handed him a piece of paper. Witnesses said his expression changed immediately. The color drained from his face. He finished the show, but something was different. The swagger was gone. The note was a death sentence. After the concert, Chalino was stopped by men claiming to be police officers. He got into their vehicle. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. The next morning, 2 farmers discovered his body beside an irrigation canal on the outskirts of the city. He was blindfolded. His wrists bore the marks of rope bindings. He had been shot twice in the back of the head. I want to ask you a chilling question about premonition. Chalino read his own death warrant on that stage. He knew what was coming. Why did he not run? Why did he not flee back across the border that same night? Was it pride? Fatalism? Or did he understand that once the cartels marked you for death, there was no escape, only delay? The murder of Chalino Sanchez remains officially unsolved to this day. No one was ever charged. No one was ever punished. But everyone in Sinaloa knew that speaking the names of the guilty would only add your own name to the list of the dead. His death did not diminish his legend. It amplified it. His widow later said she knew of over 150 corridos written in tribute to Chalino after his assassination. He became a martyr, a saint of the streets, and his murder established a terrifying template. Sing for the cartels, and you might get rich. Sing the wrong song for the wrong cartel, and you will die with a blindfold over your eyes. This is the story of the narco corrido martyr. The man who killed for his sister at 15 and was killed for his songs at 31. Chalino Sanchez sang about death until death came for him. Number 4. Selena Quintanilla Perez. We travel to Corpus Christi, Texas. The date is March 31st, 1995. This story is a betrayal so intimate that it still haunts the Latino community 3 decades later. Selena Quintanilla Perez was 23 years old and standing on the edge of global superstardom. The Queen of Tejano had already conquered the Spanish-language music world. She had won a Grammy. She had sold out the Houston Astrodome. Now she was preparing to cross over into the English-language market, a move that would have made her one of the biggest stars on the planet. But Selena had a problem. Her name was Yolanda Saldivar. Yolanda was the president of Selena's fan club and the manager of her boutiques. She was a devoted follower who had worked her way into the inner circle of Selena's life. She handled money. She handled logistics. She handled secrets. The Quintanilla family trusted her completely. That trust was catastrophically misplaced. Selena's father began noticing financial irregularities. Money was disappearing from the boutiques and the fan club. Documents were missing. When confronted, Yolanda could not explain the discrepancies. The family realized the horrible truth. Their most trusted associate had been embezzling from them for years. Yolanda was fired, but she was not finished. On that March morning, Selena drove to the Days Inn motel in Corpus Christi to retrieve financial documents from Yolanda. It was supposed to be a simple business meeting. Selena entered room 158 alone. What happened inside that room remains partially unclear. What is certain is that as Selena tried to leave, Yolanda Saldivar pulled a .38 caliber revolver from her purse and shot the Queen of Tejano in the back. The bullet severed an artery. Selena, bleeding catastrophically, somehow found the strength to run. She burst through the motel room door and staggered toward the lobby, leaving a trail of blood across the parking lot. She collapsed at the front desk. With her final breaths, she identified her killer. Yolanda Saldivar. Room 158. Then the light left her eyes. I want to ask you a devastating question about intimacy and danger. Selena was not killed by a stranger. She was not killed by a cartel or a random robber. She was killed by someone she had welcomed into her family. Someone she had trusted with her business, her dreams, her future. Does this story make you reconsider who you allow into your inner circle? Is the person closest to you the one most capable of destroying you? Yolanda Saldivar did not flee. She sat in her pickup truck in the motel parking lot with the gun to her own head, initiating a standoff that would last 9 agonizing hours. Police negotiators talked her down. She surrendered. She would face justice, not death. The trial was a national sensation. Yolanda claimed the shooting was an accident, that the gun went off as Selena tried to leave. The jury did not believe her. She was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. In March 2025, her first parole hearing was held. It was denied. She will remain behind bars until at least 2030. I want to ask you about the mathematics of grief. More than 50,000 people viewed Selena's body before her burial. 50,000 mourners filing past a casket, weeping for a woman most of them had never met. What does it mean when a stranger's death breaks your heart? Is that the true measure of an artist's impact? The tears shed by people who only knew her voice? This is the story of the Queen's betrayal. Selena Quintanilla Perez had the voice of an angel and the dreams of a conqueror. She was murdered by the woman who ran her fan club. The person hired to manage her admirers became her executioner. Chelino Sanchez sang about death until death came for him. Selena spread love until love turned its back. They are the twin pillars of tragedy in Latin music, proving that neither the dangerous path nor the wholesome one offers any guarantee of survival. If these stories of the narco-corrido martyr and the Queen's betrayal left you mourning, prepare yourself. We are about to cross deeper into Mexican territory, where the violence does not come one bullet at a time. It comes in volleys of 20. It comes with torture. And it comes from musicians who never sang a single word about drugs. Number 5. Valentin Elizalde. We cross the border and plunge into the neon-lit nightmare of northern Mexico. The date is November 25th, 2006. This story marks the moment when cartel violence against musicians escalated from isolated incidents to systematic slaughter. Valentin Elizalde was 27 years old and burning bright. They called him El Gallo de Oro, the Golden Rooster, for his flashy style and his fearless voice. He was handsome. He was charismatic. He filled arenas across Mexico and the American Southwest with fans who screamed his name like he was a god descended from the Sierra Madre. But Valentin Elizalde made a fatal choice. He sang narco-corridos. Not just any narco-corridos. Valentin wrote and performed songs that explicitly honored Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the infamous leader of the Sinaloa cartel. His music celebrated the Sinaloa faction as heroes, as men of honor in a dishonorable world. To fans of the Sinaloa cartel, Valentin was a poet laureate. To their enemies, he was a target. One song in particular signed his death warrant. It was called A Mis Enemigos, to my enemies. The lyrics were interpreted as a direct insult to Los Zetas, the ruthlessly violent cartel that had splintered from the Gulf Cartel and was waging a bloody war against Sinaloa for control of trafficking routes. The song was defiant, mocking. It dared the enemies of El Chapo to come and face consequences. They came. On the night of November 25, 2006, Valentin finished a performance in Reynosa, Tamaulipas, a city that sat directly in Zeta's territory. The concert had been electric. Thousands of fans had sung along to every word. As Valentin walked to his SUV in the parking area, those same fans crowded around, desperate for autographs, for photographs, for one more moment with their idol. They got a front row seat to his execution instead. Gunmen emerged from the shadows. They did not demand money. They did not issue warnings. They raised their weapons and opened fire. 20 bullets tore through Valentin Elizalde's body. His manager was killed. His driver was killed. His cousin Fausto was wounded, but survived to tell the story. Hundreds of fans witnessed the massacre. They watched their golden rooster crumple to the asphalt in a spreading pool of blood. They heard the screams. They smelled the gunpowder. And they understood, perhaps for the first time, that loving this music could cost you your life. I want to ask you a brutal question about artistic expression. Valentin Elizalde sang lyrics that praised one cartel and insulted another. Did those words justify 20 bullets? At what point does a song become a suicide note? And who bears responsibility when an artist is murdered for his art, the artist who created it, or the killers who could not tolerate it? Raul Hernandez Baron, an alleged high-ranking member of Los Zetas, was arrested in 2008 in connection with the murder. But justice in cartel territory is a slippery concept. The violence continued. The message had been sent. After his death, Valentin Elizalde's albums became bestsellers. He was posthumously nominated for a Grammy. His murder transformed him from a regional star into an immortal legend. The cartels had tried to silence his voice. Instead, they amplified it forever. This is the story of the Golden Rooster, the singer who crowed too loudly and was slaughtered in front of his own flock. Valentin's death was not an isolated incident. It was the opening shot in the deadliest year Mexican musicians had ever known. Number 6. Javier Morales Gomez. Just weeks after Valentin fell, another singer was gunned down. The date is December 2006. The location is a park in Michoacán, Mexico. Javier Morales Gomez was the vocalist for the band Los Implacables del Norte. He was shot to death in broad daylight. There was no clear motive, no obvious cartel connection. He was simply a working musician in the wrong place at the wrong time. His death sent a chilling message. You did not have to sing narco-corridos to die. You did not have to praise El Chapo or insult Los Zetas. You simply had to exist in an industry that the cartels had decided to terrorize. No one was safe. Not the defiant, not the neutral, not even the innocent. This is the story of the Park execution. A reminder that in cartel Mexico, simply being a musician was becoming a death sentence. The year 2006 ended with blood on the stage. But 2007 would be worse. Much worse. Number 7. Sergio Gomez. We stay in Michoacán. The date is December 2nd, 2007. This story contains details so disturbing that it changed how the entire Mexican music industry operated. This is the torture murder that proved innocence offered no protection. Sergio Gomez was 34 years old and riding a wave of success that had nothing to do with cartels or corridos. He was the lead singer of Que Paz de la Sierra, a chart-topping Duranguense band known for romantic love ballads. Songs about heartbreak, songs about devotion, songs about dancing with the person you loved under a summer moon. Sergio Gomez did not sing about drug lords. He did not glorify violence. He posed no threat to any criminal organization. He was simply talented, successful, and famous. That was enough. On the night of December 2nd, 2007, Sergio finished a concert at Estadio Morelos in Morelia. The show had been triumphant. Thousands of fans had sung along to his romantic lyrics. As Sergio left the venue with 2 concert promoters, armed men in at least 10 vehicles intercepted them on the road. This was not a robbery. This was an abduction. The promoters were released after 2 hours of terror. They emerged shaken but alive, warning that something terrible was happening to Sergio. The search began immediately. It ended the next day when authorities found his body dumped on a highway. What the killers had done to Sergio Gomez defies comprehension. He had been beaten savagely. His body bore extensive burns, including burns to his legs and his genitals. He had been tortured for hours before being strangled to death. The forensic report read like a document from a medieval dungeon, not a modern crime scene. I want to ask you a furious question about senseless cruelty. Sergio Gomez sang love songs. He celebrated romance and tenderness in a world increasingly defined by violence. Why would anyone torture a man whose only crime was making people slow dance at weddings? What message does burning a singer's flesh send when that singer never uttered a controversial word? The murder sent shockwaves through the Mexican music industry. Que Paz de la Sierra, based in Chicago, disbanded after losing their frontman. Artists across the country began canceling tours in dangerous regions. The calculation had changed. It was no longer enough to avoid singing narco corridos. Simply being a successful musician in Mexico meant you could be kidnapped, tortured, and murdered for reasons that would never be explained. Sergio Gomez had reportedly received death threats before his final concert. He performed anyway. Perhaps he believed the threats were empty. Perhaps he felt he had no choice. Perhaps he simply loved music too much to let fear silence him. I want to ask you about the courage of performance. Every time Sergio Gomez walked onto a stage after those threats, he was gambling with his life. Do we appreciate how brave some artists must be simply to practice their craft? When singing a love song requires the courage of a soldier, what does that say about the world we have built? His case remains officially unsolved. No one was ever charged. No one was ever punished. The men who burned and strangled Sergio Gomez walked free into the Michoacán night and disappeared into a country where impunity was the only law that mattered. This is the story of the tortured troubadour, the romantic who was butchered because the cartels had decided that all musicians were fair game. Sergio Gomez sang about love and paid with hours of unimaginable agony. Number 8. Zaida Peña. We stay in the blood-soaked nightmare of 2007. The date is November 30th. This story contains a detail so brazen, so utterly devoid of fear, that it proves the killers had achieved something worse than violence. They had achieved complete impunity. Zaida Peña was 28 years old and the rising star of grupera music. She fronted a band called Zaida y los Culpables, and her specialty was not narco-corridos or cartel anthems. She sang romantic ballads, love songs, music designed to make couples hold each other closer on the dance floor. She was beautiful, talented, and beloved by fans across northern Mexico. She was also the daughter of a woman who worked for the district attorney's office in Matamoros, Tamaulipas. If any singer should have had protection, it was Zaida Peña. If any musician should have been untouchable, it was the child of someone connected to law enforcement. It made no difference. On that November night, Zaida was at a hotel in Matamoros when gunmen burst in. The attack was sudden and savage. Bullets flew through the air. 2 other people in the hotel were killed instantly. Zaida was shot in the neck, but she survived. The bullet had torn through her flesh, but missed the vital structures. She was rushed to a local hospital where doctors worked frantically to stabilize her condition. Against all odds, she was going to live. The assassination had failed. Zaida Peña would recover, return to the stage, and continue spreading her music across Mexico. That is what should have happened. The next day, a gunman walked into the hospital. He moved through the corridors with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he was going to do. He found Zaida Peña lying in her hospital bed, recovering from the wounds that should have killed her. He raised his weapon and finished what the first attack had started. I want to ask you a terrifying question about sanctuary. A hospital is supposed to be sacred ground, a place where even enemies lay down their weapons because the mission of healing supersedes all conflict. What kind of world have we entered when a killer can walk into a medical facility and execute a patient in her bed? When nurses and doctors must witness murder in the halls where they save lives? The brazenness of the hospital execution sent a message that echoed across Mexico. There was nowhere to hide. Not your home, not a concert venue, not even a hospital room surrounded by medical professionals. If the cartels wanted you dead, they would find you. They would finish you. And no institution in Mexican society had the power or the will to stop them. I want to ask you about the failure of systems. Zaida's mother worked for the district attorney. The family had connections to law enforcement. The hospital had security. None of it mattered. When every institution designed to protect citizens fails simultaneously, what recourse do ordinary people have? This is the story of the hospital execution. The woman who survived her own murder only to be murdered again. Zaida Peña sang about love and was executed in her hospital bed. Number 9. José Luis Aquino. The same week that claimed Zaida Peña's life also claimed José Luis Aquino, a 33-year-old trumpet player for the band Los Conde. José Luis was not a star. He was not famous. He did not have fans screaming his name or albums climbing the charts. He was a working musician, a man who showed up to gigs, played his instrument with skill and passion, and collected his modest pay. He was the backbone of the Mexican music industry, one of thousands of anonymous artists who make the famous singers sound complete. His body was discovered in the southern state of Oaxaca. His hands were bound. His head had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. He had been beaten to death with the methodical brutality of men who wanted to send a message, but did not care enough about their victim to use a bullet. José Luis Aquino was not a narco-corrido singer. He did not have cartel connections. He did not glorify drug lords or insult their enemies. He was simply a trumpet player who existed in an industry that had become a killing field. I want to ask you a mournful question about the anonymous dead. We remember Valentin Elizalde because he was famous. We remember Selena because she was a queen. But how many José Luis Aquinos have died without anyone recording their names? How many working musicians have been found in ditches and back alleys, their deaths never making headlines, their stories never told? Is a trumpet player's life worth less than a lead singer's? His death, combined with Sergio Gomez and Zaida Peña in the same week, created panic in Mexico's music industry. Artists began refusing bookings in certain states. Concert promoters could not find performers willing to risk their lives for a paycheck. The music was dying along with the musicians. This is the story of the bound trumpet player. A reminder that fame offers no protection, but neither does obscurity. José Luis Aquino played the trumpet and was bludgeoned with his hands tied. Number 10. Banda Fugaz. Earlier in 2007, in February, 4 members of the musical group Banda Fugaz had already been added to the body count. The band had finished a performance in Michoacán, a state that had become a slaughterhouse. Cartel factions were fighting block by block for control of trafficking routes, and anyone caught in the crossfire was simply collateral damage. As the 4 musicians left their gig, gunmen appeared. There was no negotiation, no robbery, no interrogation, just bullets. 4 men who had spent their evening entertaining crowds, making people dance, helping strangers forget their troubles for a few hours, were executed in the street. Their instruments were left behind. Their bodies were left as warnings. I want to ask you about the geography of death. Michoacán in 2007 was not a state. It was a battlefield. Musicians who accepted gigs there were not just booking performances. They were accepting combat deployments without weapons, without training, without any chance of fighting back. I want to ask you a furious question about romanticizing danger. There is a tendency in music culture to celebrate artists who live on the edge. We glorify the outlaw. We worship the rebel. We buy albums from singers who claim to have survived impossible circumstances. But this is what the edge actually looks like. Bound hands, burned flesh, hospital executions, bullet-riddled bodies in parking lots. Is the mythology worth the reality? The year 2007 stands as the deadliest in the history of Mexican music. When historians tally the bodies, when researchers count the graves, 2007 rises above all other years like a blood-red monument to impunity. This is the story of the massacred band. The members of Banda Fugaz provided entertainment and were provided with bullets. They are among the martyrs of 2007, the year Mexican music learned that no genre, no fame level, and no institution could protect you. If these stories left you struggling to comprehend the scale of the violence, understand that we have not yet reached the worst. The body count is about to multiply. Number 11. Fabian Ortega. We advance through the years of bloodshed to October 19, 2010. The location is a desolate highway in Chihuahua, Mexico. This story is different from the others. This is not an innocent victim. This is a man who chose to dance with the devil and paid the inevitable price. Fabian Ortega was known as El Halcón de la Sierra, the Hawk of the Sierra. He was a grupero singer who had built his career on narco corridos that explicitly honored drug traffickers. He did not pretend to be neutral. He did not hide behind romantic ballads. He wrote songs celebrating the cartel lifestyle, glorifying the men who moved cocaine and murdered their rivals. He performed at private parties for cartel bosses who paid him in cash that smelled like blood. And he lived the life he sang about. The year before his death, Fabian Ortega was arrested on a yacht in circumstances that read like a movie script. On that boat, authorities found crystal methamphetamine, illegal weapons, $20,000 in cash, and over 844 assault rifle rounds. But the most chilling detail was his company. Fabian was traveling with a man known as El Pozolero, the stew maker, a cartel hitman infamous for dissolving the bodies of victims in vats of acid. I want to ask you a complicated question about complicity. When a singer is found on a yacht with a man who melts human beings into liquid, can we still call him a victim when violence eventually finds him? Fabian Ortega knew exactly who he was dealing with. He attended their parties. He counted their money. He befriended their executioners. Does that knowledge change how we mourn him? On that October morning, Fabian Ortega's body was found on a Chihuahua highway alongside two other corpses. He had been riddled with bullets. Shell casings littered the scene, suggesting multiple shooters had participated in his execution. The Hawk of the Sierra had finally been grounded. His song Puros Huevos y Frijoles had attempted to explain the temptation of drug trafficking to poor Mexicans. Just beans and eggs, the title translated, a reference to the poverty that drove young men into cartel employment. He understood the economics of desperation. He profited from singing about it. And ultimately, he died because of it. I want to ask you about the seduction of danger. Fabian Ortega could have sung about anything: love, heartbreak, dancing. Instead, he chose the narco-corrido path, knowing it had already claimed Valentin Elizalde and countless others. Was the money worth it? Was the fame? When you see a dozen artists murdered for the same choice and you make that choice anyway, are you brave or foolish? This is the story of the complicit hawk, the singer who flew too close to the cartel's sun and was incinerated by its heat. Number 12, Wayne Mills. Lest we believe this violence was confined to Mexico, we must return to American soil. We travel to Nashville, Tennessee. The date is November 23, 2013. This story proves that senseless murder does not require cartels or vendettas. Sometimes it only requires ego, alcohol, and a gun. Wayne Mills was 44 years old and a fixture of the outlaw country scene. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, a gentle giant who had spent decades mentoring younger artists. Blake Shelton considered him a friend. Jamie Johnson respected his talent. Craig Wayne Boyd, who would later win The Voice, had learned from Wayne's example. He was the real deal, a man who lived the honky-tonk life and wrote songs that captured its whiskey-soaked truth. On that November night, Wayne was drinking at a Nashville bar called the Pit and Barrel. The establishment was closed to the public. A private gathering was winding down. The bar's owner, Chris Farrell, was also Wayne's friend. They had known each other for years. They had shared drinks and stories and the easy camaraderie of men who loved country music. Then, Wayne lit a cigarette. The Pit and Barrel had a no-smoking policy. Chris Farrell told Wayne to put it out. Wayne refused. What should have been a minor disagreement between friends escalated into a verbal confrontation. Voices were raised. Egos flared. Farrell cleared the room, locking the door with just himself and Wayne inside. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. When police arrived, they found Wayne Mills dead on the floor with a bullet wound to the back of his head. Chris Farrell claimed self-defense. He invoked Tennessee's Stand Your Ground law, telling officers that Wayne had threatened to kill him, that Wayne had broken a beer glass and was lunging toward him in a drunken rage. The forensics told a different story. The bullet had entered the back of Wayne's head, he was not lunging forward. He was likely turning to leave or trying to escape when Farrell pulled the trigger. You cannot claim self-defense when you shoot a man in the back of the skull from 15 to 20 feet away. I want to ask you a devastating question about friendship and firearms. Wayne Mills and Chris Farrell knew each other. They had shared countless nights in that very bar. How does a cigarette transform a friend into a corpse? How do two men who have laughed together end up with one dead and one holding a smoking gun? Is alcohol the accelerant, or is there something darker lurking in men who need weapons to feel powerful? The trial was emotional. Jamie Johnson testified about Wayne's character. The prosecution argued that this was not self-defense, but cold-blooded murder. The jury convicted Chris Farrell of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years without the possibility of parole. The judge gave no weight to the self-defense claim. The evidence was too clear. I want to ask you a furious question about stand-your-ground laws. These statutes were designed to protect victims from attackers. Instead, they have become shields for killers looking for legal cover. When a man shoots another man in the back of the head and claims he was afraid for his life, has the law failed? The pit and barrel was later demolished. The building where Wayne drew his last breath was erased from the Nashville landscape. But the memory remains. This is the story of the barroom betrayal. Wayne Mills was the mentor who was murdered by a friend because he would not extinguish his cigarette. Number 13, Combo, Colombia. Now we return to Mexico for the single most horrific incident in the history of musician murders. The year is 2013. The location is Nuevo León. This is the story of 17 souls erased in a single act of cartel vengeance. Combo, Colombia was a cumbia and corrido band with 17 members. They were not superstars, but they were working musicians with families and futures. They had found a patron in the Los Zetas cartel, one of the most violent criminal organizations in Mexican history. The Zetas hired them for private parties. The Zetas paid them well. The Zetas considered them part of the extended family. But loyalty in the cartel world is a death sentence waiting to be signed. At some point, Combo Colombia accepted a gig from a rival faction. Perhaps they did not understand the implications. Perhaps they believed they could serve multiple masters. Perhaps they simply needed the money and did not ask questions. Whatever the reason, they played a party for the enemies of Los Zetas. The punishment was absolute. All 17 members of Combo Colombia were kidnapped. All 17 were executed. Their bodies were discovered after an investigation revealed the horrifying truth. The musicians had been ordered killed by their original benefactors. The Zetas did not tolerate disloyalty. Playing for the wrong party was treason, and treason meant death for everyone who held an instrument. I want to ask you a sickening question about impossible choices. These 17 musicians were trapped between cartels that viewed human life as currency. Refuse a gig and risk offending the people who requested it. Accept a gig and risk offending the people who claimed you as their own. There was no safe choice. There was only the illusion of choice. How do you navigate a world where every decision is potentially fatal? This remains the deadliest single incident involving murdered musicians in recorded history. 17 men who wanted nothing more than to play music and support their families were slaughtered because they attended the wrong party. This is the story of the massacred band, a reminder that cartel loyalty is not protection. It is ownership, and owners dispose of property whenever they choose. If these stories of the complicit hawk, the barroom betrayal, and the massacred 17 left you reeling, know that the violence has not ended. We are about to enter the 2020s, where families are ambushed with 150 bullets and rising stars are found handcuffed on highways. Number 14. Rogelio Brambilla Lizarraga. The calendar advances, but the killing continues. We travel to Tijuana, Mexico. The date is March 21st, 2015. This story is about a young man who never had the chance to learn from the mistakes of those who came before him. Rogelio Brambilla Lizarraga was 22 years old. Just 22. He was the singer for a band called Los Plebes del Arranque, and he had grown up in a Mexico where narco-corridos were not just music, but identity. He had watched Valentin Elizalde become a legend. He had seen how cartel connections could transform a poor singer into a wealthy star. He made his choice. His songs referenced the notorious Arellano Felix Cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Tijuana's bloody history. He sang their praises. He glorified their violence. He positioned himself as their musical representative in an industry where such positioning had already filled dozens of graves. His body was found in a parked car in Tijuana. He had been riddled with bullets from 2 different firearms, suggesting multiple shooters had participated in his execution. The forensic detail of the 2 guns painted a picture of coordinated assassination. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was not a crime of passion. This was a professional hit carried out by men who had done this many times before. I want to ask you a sorrowful question about youth and mortality. Rogelio was 22 years old. At 22, most people are just beginning to understand who they are. They are making mistakes that they will spend decades correcting. Rogelio made one mistake and was given no decades, no second chances, no opportunity to choose a different path. When we see young artists dying for the same choices that killed artists a decade earlier, do we blame them for not learning? Or do we blame a system that makes those choices seem glamorous? His death was part of a cluster of narco-corrido artist killings within a 4-week span in 2015. The pattern had become seasonal. Every few years, the bodies would accumulate, the industry would mourn, and then a new generation of singers would step forward to replace the fallen, convinced that they would be the exception. This is the story of the youngest hawk, a boy who bet his life on cartel loyalty and lost before he was old enough to truly understand the stakes. Number 15. Los Norteños de Rio Bravo. 3 years later, in 2018, 2 members of the musical group Los Norteños de Rio Bravo joined the ever-growing list of the murdered. The details are sparse because the deaths were barely investigated. The 2 musicians were kidnapped by armed men. Their bodies were later discovered on the federal highway connecting Reynosa to Rio Bravo, a stretch of asphalt that had become notorious as a corridor controlled by warring cartel factions. This highway was a graveyard disguised as a road. Travelers who used it understood they were rolling dice with their lives. Truckers told stories of vehicles being stopped at gunpoint. Families described detours of hundreds of miles to avoid the route. And yet musicians continued to travel it because their jobs required them to be in dangerous places, performing for dangerous crowds. I want to ask you about the infrastructure of death. When a highway becomes so synonymous with murder that locals give it nicknames referencing the afterlife, who bears responsibility? The government that cannot secure it? The cartels that control it? Or the ordinary citizens who continue to use it because they have no other options? Los Norteños de Rio Bravo were simply trying to get from one gig to another. The road itself became their executioner. Their names have faded from public memory. They were not famous enough to generate sustained outrage. They were simply 2 more bodies on a highway that had seen hundreds. This is the story of the highway dead. A reminder that in cartel Mexico, the journey is as dangerous as the destination. Number 16. Kevin Hernandez. Now we arrive at the most devastating case of the modern era. The date is May 5th, 2024. The location is a rural road in Chihuahua. This story involves not just a singer, but his entire family, including children who will carry the trauma of this day for the rest of their lives. Kevin Hernandez was 34 years old and a rising star in Mexican country music. He had the voice, he had the charisma, he had the growing fan base that suggested a long career ahead of him. He also had a wife named Marisela Sandoval, also 34. He had a 17-year-old son. He had a 14-year-old child. He had a 4-year-old child. He had a grandmother who loved them all. On that May morning, the family was traveling in a convoy of pickup trucks through Chihuahua. They were not heading to a concert. They were not conducting business in dangerous territory. They were simply a family on the road. The ambush came without warning. Gunmen opened fire on the convoy with a ferocity that defies description. When investigators arrived at the scene, they collected 150 shell casings from the ground. 150 bullets fired at a family traveling together on a rural road. The mathematics of that violence is almost impossible to process. 150 triggers pulled, 150 chances to stop, 150 decisions to continue killing. Kevin Hernandez was found dead inside his Chevrolet Malibu, his body torn apart by the barrage. His wife Marisela was discovered lying on the road outside the vehicle, where she had either fallen or been dragged after trying to escape. Their 17-year-old son survived the initial attack, but died the next day in a hospital, his wounds too catastrophic to overcome. The 14-year-old and the 4-year-old survived. They watched their parents die. They heard the gunfire that killed their brother. They emerged from that convoy carrying wounds that no surgeon could ever heal. I want to ask you a devastating question about children and violence. There are 2 young people alive today who watched their family massacred around them, who heard their mother's screams, who saw their father's blood. What does that do to a developing mind? How does a 4-year-old process the sight of 150 bullets tearing apart everything they love? These children did not choose the music industry. They did not choose the narco-corrido life. They were simply born to a singer. And for that accident of birth, they must carry these images forever. But the horror was not finished. The next day, armed men appeared at the home of Marisela's parents, the grandparents, the people who were likely preparing to take custody of the orphaned children. The gunmen opened fire on the house. This was not a robbery. This was not a random attack. This was a message, a vendetta so complete that it extended beyond the primary target to encompass everyone connected to him by blood or marriage. I want to ask you a chilling question about total war. What did Kevin Hernandez do to deserve the attempted annihilation of his entire family tree? What song could he have sung? What alliance could he have made that justified murdering his wife, his son, and then attacking his in-laws the very next day? This was not business. This was extermination. The final cruel irony emerged one day after the shooting. Kevin Hernandez had recently recorded a song titled Si Dios me lleva con él, If God Takes Me With Him. The lyrics spoke of death, of divine protection, of accepting one's fate with grace. The song was released the day after his murder, its prophetic words echoing across a Mexico that had grown numb to such brutal coincidences. I want to ask you about art as prophecy. Did Kevin Hernandez sense what was coming? Did he record those lyrics as a premonition, as a prayer, as a goodbye disguised as a single? When artists create work about their own mortality and then die violently, do we call it coincidence? Or do we acknowledge that some people feel the shadow falling before it lands? This is the story of the family ambush. Kevin Hernandez sang about God taking him. God took him, and his wife, and his son. The 4-year-old and the 14-year-old remain. They are the living witnesses to what 150 bullets can do to a family on a quiet road in Chihuahua. If this story of the family massacre left you struggling to breathe, know that we have one final descent to make. Number 17, Chuy, Montana. We arrive at our final case. The date is February 7, 2024. The location is the highway connecting Rosarito to Tijuana, a stretch of road that has become synonymous with cartel executions. This story represents everything we have learned about the intersection of music and murder in the modern era. Chuy, Montana was born Jesus Cardenas, and his rise to fame reads like a corrido unto itself. He did not emerge from a record label's development program or a reality television competition. He built his reputation one car window at a time, performing for drivers stuck in traffic at the Tijuana-San Isidro border crossing. While thousands of people waited hours to cross into the United States, Chuy, Montana walked between the vehicles, singing corridos tumbados, the modern evolution of the narco-corrido genre. He passed a hat. He collected tips. He earned his audience through pure hustle. The hustle worked. His videos went viral. His talent was undeniable. He caught the attention of Street Mob Records, the label founded by Fuerza Regida, one of the biggest names in regional Mexican music. He was signed. He was promoted. He was on the verge of the breakthrough that would transform him from a border busker into a legitimate star. He never got there. On that February morning, Chuy, Montana's body was discovered on the highway. He had been shot multiple times in the head and arms. But the detail that transforms this from a murder into a message is what investigators found on his wrists. He was handcuffed. He had been kidnapped, restrained, and executed. The handcuffs suggest he was held for some period before his death. The wounds to his arms suggest he may have tried to escape, to fight back, to survive the unsurvivable. I want to ask you a haunting question about final moments. Chuy, Montana spent his last hours knowing he was going to die. Handcuffed, helpless, perhaps driven along the very highways where he had once dreamed of touring. What goes through a young man's mind in those moments? Does he think about the songs he will never write? The stages he will never grace? The family he will never see again? Or does the mind simply shut down, unable to process the enormity of its own extinction? His death came amid a wave of threats against major corridos tumbados artists. Peso Pluma, one of the genre's biggest stars, had received explicit death threats from cartels angry about his lyrical content. Fuerza Regida, the very label that had signed Chuy, Montana, had been warned. The entire genre was under siege. And Chuy, Montana, the young man who had worked his way up from nothing, became the demonstration of what happened when the cartels decided a musician had crossed an invisible line. In response to the ongoing violence, Tijuana took an unprecedented step. The city banned narco-corrido performances entirely. No more concerts glorifying drug traffickers. No more stages for singers who praised cartel violence. It was an admission of defeat disguised as policy. The government could not protect musicians from being murdered, so instead they prohibited the music that seemed to invite the murders. I want to ask you a profound question about censorship and survival. When a city bans an entire genre of music because performing it has become a death sentence, who wins? Have the cartels achieved a victory more complete than any military campaign? They have silenced the songs. They have killed the singers. They have made an art form itself illegal. Is there any more total form of cultural annihilation? This is the story of the handcuffed highway execution, the border busker who sang his way to a record deal and was rewarded with bullets. But the killing did not stop with Chuy, Montana. The year 2025 has already added fresh blood to the ledger. In Zapopan, Jalisco, Ernesto Barajas of the band Enigma Norteño was gunned down in a parking lot by two assassins on motorcycles. His band had over 4 million monthly listeners on Spotify. They were known for narco corridos, dedicated to both the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel. Perhaps he believed serving both masters offered protection. Perhaps he did not understand that in the cartel world, neutrality is as dangerous as loyalty. The motorcycle assassins proved otherwise. In Reynosa, Tamaulipas, the violence reached a new low of calculated cruelty. 5 members of the band Fugitivo were lured to what they believed was a legitimate gig. When they arrived, they found a vacant lot. No stage, no audience, no equipment, just armed men waiting to kidnap them. Their bodies were discovered after their families received ransom demands that were never intended to be honored. The fake gig was a trap. The ransom was theater. The murders were predetermined. I want to ask you a sickening question about evolution of cruelty. The cartels have learned that they can use the music industry's own infrastructure against it. Book a fake show. Promise payment. Watch desperate musicians drive into the kill zone. How do working bands protect themselves from this? Do they demand proof of venue? Confirmation of promoters? Background checks on every person who offers them work? The economics of the industry make such caution impossible. Musicians need gigs. Killers know this. The trap is inherent to the profession. We have traveled more than 50 years. We have crossed 2 nations. We have counted more than 50 bodies. From the cabin of Stringbean in 1973 to the vacant lot in Reynosa in 2025, the pattern has remained constant. Musicians die. The music continues. New artists rise to replace the fallen. And then they fall too. I want to ask you a final question about the cost of art. Every singer we have discussed knew the risks. Stringbean knew that rumors of his wealth made him a target. Chalino Sanchez read his own death note on stage and performed anyway. Valentin Elizalde sang songs that insulted Los Zetas and drove into their territory. Wayne Mills refused to put out his cigarette when a friend with a gun asked him to. Each of them made choices. Each of them paid the ultimate price. But what about the innocent? Sergio Gomez sang love songs and was tortured to death. The children of Kevin Hernandez committed no crime except being born to a singer. Jose Luis Aquino simply played the trumpet. Zaida Peña sang romantic ballads and was executed in her hospital bed. The violence does not discriminate between the complicit and the blameless. It simply consumes. The corrido continues. The genre that celebrates outlaws and mourns the dead will not die, no matter how many of its performers are silenced. New voices emerge from the border crossings and the dive bars and the recording studios of Tijuana and Los Angeles. They know the history. They have seen the graves, and still they pick up microphones and sing. Perhaps that is the final lesson. Music is stronger than murder. Songs outlive the singers who create them. Chalino Sanchez has been dead for more than 30 years. But his voice still plays in cars and cantinas across 2 continents. Selena's albums still sell. Valentin Elizalde's corridos still echo through the night. The killers achieved nothing permanent. They silenced individuals. They could not silence the art. Behind the rhinestones and the steel guitars, there is a graveyard. But above that graveyard, there is music. There will always be music. And as long as there are singers brave enough or foolish enough to lift their voices in dangerous places, there will be songs worth dying for. This concludes our journey through 17 horrifying cases of country singers murdered in rural vendettas. If this series opened your eyes to the blood-soaked history behind the music, share it to honor those who paid the ultimate price for their art. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Our next investigation is already underway. 10 social media stars who died creating content. The rooftopper who fell 62 stories. The YouTuber killed by an encyclopedia. The TikToker who live-streamed her own crash. The camera is always rolling, and sometimes it captures the final frame.